Whenever I explain Fallout to someone, I usually explain it as a setting rather than a game. With Elder Scrolls, for example, you usually start with, oh, it's an open world exploration game where you can do anything you want to. But the problem with this and Fallout is the fact that Fallout has spanned over several genres. It has been a CRPG, an isometric tactical game, a top-down twin-stick shooter, multiple renditions of a pen-and-paper rule set, a shooter RPG hybrid, a cash shop promotional mobile game, and well, whatever Fallout 4 is. Tackling it as a setting means we'll be able to dissect the series at its very core, the stuff that really resonates with so many people from digging into the games, stuff like Divergence, Radiation, the FEV, and Fallout's pre-war America. So we'll first get started with the very event that causes the Fallout world itself. Divergence explains the idea that Fallout takes place on a divergent Earth, one that kept the motions, feelings, and projections of the future in the vein of 50s decor and technological innovations of that time period into the far future. A common misconception in Fallout's world is that it takes place in our world up until the 50s or so when it diverged. But after Bethesda's alterations to the series with the Zaytans, it's honestly better to think of Fallout's universe as being completely separate from ours, only being remarkably similar up until the 50s where American culture, attitudes, optimism, and constant threat of nuclear annihilation never stopped. In this way, we can let things that happened in the far history of Fallout's universe not collide with our history. Divergence serves to explain two things in the Fallout world that directly contrast to what happens in ours. The first is the lack of an invented transistor for most of Fallout's history, leading to the vision of the future American household to resemble something from, say, the Jetsons. The second is the fact that communism in the Fallout world was successful in its goals and retained its ability of being a direct threat to democracy. Therefore, in the Fallout world, communism continued to grow, and eventually, China became America's worst enemy. Then, in 2052, with the world far past the peak oil event, the resource wars begin, an outbreak of the new plague happens, and the world is set for damnation. But before we get into that, I want to take a minute to talk about Fallout's rendition of America right before the Great War broke out. Fallout's America is described as severely different than the one we live in. It holds within it a populace of xenophobic nationalists who couldn't care less for the well-being of other countries, much like the Brotherhood of Steel is towards the Wasteland, ironically. The GNN broadcast we see in the introduction of Fallout 1 depicts a United States powered armored infantryman gunning down a Canadian freedom fighter, most likely before or shortly after the 2067 annexation of Canada. This clearly paints a picture of the world that existed before the Wasteland was created. We also see an advert for Vault-Tec, one of the many corporations that ruled this American society, clearly exploiting the anxiety that many people have of nuclear devastation. In the same way that companies used our natural evolutionary addiction to sugars to fuel the food industry, Fallout corporations used the war as a way to keep themselves afloat in the new, struggling economic world. One element of the pre-war world that isn't often explored in Fallout was the transformation of America from a republic to a militaristic oligarchy, primarily controlled and policed by a military junta and the many influential corporations. There are many causes of this, but the primary cause is when martial law was enacted, due to the threats of nuclear annihilation, regular rioting, and biological attacks. Many places like Canada and pre-war Hopeville were sites of war protester slaughter, whilst those who chose not to aid the military in committing these war crimes were actually taken in as military prisoners who would later be experimented on at the Mariposa military base. The government-funded Project Safe House, once a benign attempt to create underground cities that could protect an entire population from extinction, quickly turned into a plan to test humanity. The many higher-up oligarchs had already reserved their bomb-protected spots, like the offshore oil tanker off the coast of California, and couldn't care less to what happens to those on the mainland. I think it's safe to say that the world before the war wasn't very well off or really worth protecting at all. This creates the idea that it wasn't the perfect pre-war world that was lost, it was the nostalgia for the world that could have been. Fallout's world lost itself to consumption. They consumed and consumed and consumed until nothing was left, and then through neglect, greed, hypocrisy, and fluctuation of power, they turned that nothing into ashes, sparking the world we love to play in today. It's quite the origin story.